I want to welcome everyone to the April's Housing Hive session. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. If you are new to us, this Housing Hive is a webinar we've been running for around sort of 4 years or so since lockdown, and it's relatively informal, to be honest, but it is a monthly focused conversation where we try to bring together people from across the space, from across the housing sector in various different forms to discuss real challenges and opportunities, and hopefully share some insights as well and inspiration from those actually carrying out the work. And I think we're in quite a beneficial position of having worked in this space for over 20 years, of having a lot of contacts to sort of tap into for this kind of session. So hopefully everyone takes something away from it today. But yeah, we always try and base the topic on specific challenges that we're hearing about from our active clients, but also just generally sort of either potentially regulatory changes or sector-wide changes, which people are obviously sort of spending time discussing and planning for as well. So one of the things which we're hearing quite a lot in this space at the moment is the growing pressure across the board, really, to leverage digital in many ways to create the much needed capacity. We know that everyone's quite stretched already as things stand today, and sort of expectations are ever evolving, as well as sort of improving service delivery, keep pace with that sort of regulatory evolution as that changes over time, but also develop greater transparency with residents as well, most importantly, and to sort of build trust with them. And I think quite often when we discuss this with our sort of user base, data sometimes comes up as a little bit of a blocker to making some of those things happen. It is quite common, based on the sort of conversations we have, to see data itself stored in disparate systems and some low confidence in sort of the quality around that as well. And as a result, that kind of means that organisations do struggle quite often to trust the insights that they're getting hold of, which then therefore makes it harder to act upon and sort of make those data-driven decisions that we're kind of here to talk about today. Off the back of a little bit of sort of pre-research as part of this session and discussions with the panellists who we'll introduce shortly, we found that according to some data from Hack, that poor quality data is estimated to cost the UK housing sector about £400 million a year, which obviously is funds and sort of investment that could be spent far better in terms of service improvements, in terms of new housing, and sort of net zero and those sorts of things. And 2024 research as well, done by Service Insights, found that it was actually just under 99% of housing professionals believe data quality is essential to service delivery, but only around 80% of them are actually confident that it'll improve the organisation based on sort of trust of the quality of it as well. So I think now more than ever, we need to get ahead of this as a sort of a housing sector across the board. You guys as sort of HAs and sort of RPs generally need to be able to demonstrate how that you're listening to residents, how you're assessing customer sentiment, acting on feedback, and at the same time putting robust plans in place and measures in place to work through proactive asset management, responsive repairs, especially with the likes of Awab's law coming into effect later this year. But this all needs to be informed by reliable, accessible, and actionable data generally, really. We had 2 CEOs join us on the call last month, as well as our consultancy, and we talked about the record levels of spend on repairs as reported by Inside Housing for that last financial year. And one of the things we discussed is that competing demands for investment for boards, for chief execs, are increasingly sort of, I suppose the focus is increasingly being put towards internal data to sort of help prioritise some of this stuff. But that can only really happen if that data is of a quality which can be trusted, really. So I think today's session is going to be all around getting into the reality of that. How do we move from the sort of the sentiment of seeing data as a blocker to making sort of decisions, but also seeing it as moving towards seeing it as a genuine sort of enabler for these things, for better services and ultimately, hopefully, better outcomes for residents as well. But yeah, I think to sort of help us move through that, we are joined by 3 great panelists today who bring slightly different sort of insights and perspectives to this sort of topic, I guess. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. If we could start with you, Daz, if that's okay, and then move through you 2 guys as well.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Jake. So I'm Daz Chauhan. I'm a director at Knowledge Industry. So I work across quite a few different housing organisations and across the public sector in general. And I help organisations with data strategy, governance, analytics, architecture, and anything that falls in between that. I've worked within housing associations and with them for about eight to 9 years as well. But we do a lot of work in the education sector as well.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tas. Over to you, Andreea.
Thank you. I'm Andreea. I'm the head of digital data and technology for Community Gateway. I've recently joined Community Gateway. However, this would be my 10th year in the housing sector. Pass on to you.
Thank you, Andreea. Over to you, Eli.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Eli, and I'm head of data and business intelligence at Great Places. So within the housing industry, I think I'm 9 months in, but I've been working with data for quite a while, mainly within central government. So yeah, some very interesting opportunities in this space. Quite exciting.
Thanks for those introductions, guys, and again, thanks for your time to join us today as well. We will keep today's format kind of sort of roundtable style discussion rather than sort of PowerPoint slides or sort of presentation based, but we are going to guide it through with three key themes, if you like. So we'll open it up, obviously, to if you guys on the call have any questions, feel free to use the chat and sort of get any queries you have in there, and we'll look to sort of service those as well. But we will provide a bit of a structure to this to sort of keep us on track. So we'll explore it through three key lenses, I suppose, which aren't necessarily silos. They do absolutely overlap, but they help us kind of frame just getting through the main parts of this conversation. Because when we were prepping for this, we could probably do a series of this particular topic over a number of months. So we'll try and stay on track as much as we can. But first we'll cover foundations, so infrastructure, governance, and readiness needs, and what needs to be in place to make a good use of data generally, and how do we assess where we are now before deciding where to go next. We'll cover people as well, because you can have the best strategy in the world, but it's not going to work unless your teams feel confident and capable enough to use that data and sort of bringing those on board. But also culture as well. So what it takes to kind of enable that data-driven mindset internally from the front line to the boardroom, really, and how do we shift from a reactive kind of mindset to more sort of reporting-led and more proactive. So yeah, we'll get kicked off then. So I suppose just to begin with, based on the prep that we discussed between us guys, thought I'd come to yourself first, Andreea, in terms of when we were discussing about those foundations. We kind of covered the importance. Well, you yourself put forward the importance of sort of assessing the now as a critical step. So why would you say that's so critical from your experience in terms of sort of moving through this sort of project or shift or change?
I think it's really critical, just because the housing sector is going through a stage, let's say a hype around dashboards, AI, and very clever insight. Yeah, we all want that. All the executives want that, and rightly so. However, when you actually produce these results, you don't necessarily get the return on investment that you expect. And that's because the foundation you're building upon isn't right. You either don't have the right technology in place, you don't have the right culture, and people just don't know how to use and leverage the data in a very meaningful way. And that's why the foundational piece becomes very, very important before we do anything. So in terms of foundations, as I mentioned, it's not just about the tech stack, about choosing the right technology. It's about understanding the organization that you're working with, starting with the exec and finishing with the frontline workers. So all of those interactions that people have with data will be an indicator of the status quo. And that is your starting point. That will help you build to a better outcome and better return on investment.
Yeah. And have you seen, I suppose, any sort of resistance to that in the past in terms of organisations just looking to want to maybe move forward a little bit quicker rather than sort of having to spend or agreeing to spend that time up front to sort of assess where things are right now first? Absolutely.
And I think the other panelists would agree that, as I said, everyone wants the shiny new dashboard and wants to believe that is, the end of the journey. However, data is part of the fabric of the organization, so it needs an entire ecosystem built around it that is supported by the culture in the organization to actually provide you with what you need.
Yeah. Is that something you sort of to echo, Daz, from your perspective as a consultant working with many associations on this particular sort of topic?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, because some of the larger organizations are doing some really good work in the AI and the predictive space as well. And I think it is a challenge. People are discussing AI, but I think we heard on the Housing Hive a few months ago that Arturo shared as well about some of the challenges that we have with deploying artificial intelligence too soon, and some of the challenges around hallucinations and incorrect responses as well as having the necessary guardrails and the policies around AI as well. And I think, as Andreea mentioned, what we need to make sure is that the data quality underneath is actually sound. It's great to have the appetite there to actually move forward from a more innovative space, because it's quite rare for that to happen. But if we've got the executive of the organizations, championing using AI, there's a lot of good things that can come from that in regards to data quality management, and data governance as well. So this will kind of set the foundation to be able to deploy these technologies, which is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. On that point then, what would you say, or what are the typical things you'd sort of suggest looking at for organisations who are looking to assess current data maturity in terms of where things are right now? What are the types of things you look for?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different areas that we need to look at. So a good data maturity assessment is always a good starting point. And there's a few ones that you can use, like Gartner have got one, which is more geared towards enterprise level organizations. Orchard, the government have got a really good one as well. And what they do is they look at different capabilities within an organization. So it could be infrastructure and technology, data operations, so how well the machine's running, performance reporting, data literacy, data governance, having a data strategy, engineering, all of these different things. It's a great starting point, and I think it will help with the production of a score that can determine where you are right now in your journey. So the question that you asked Andreea originally, how do you assess the now? A data maturity assessment is a great way to do that. It's not the only way, but it is a good way to start, because what it does, it gives you like a data maturity score, which you can then visualize using a radar diagram. And using that radar diagram, then it acts as your baseline, and then you can start to periodically, maybe annually, rerun that assessment to see if you are making progress. And again, to tie it in with the AI aspect as well, you will have a look at data governance, data management, and data quality as a part of that as well. But as I mentioned, it's not the only way to assess where you are now. There's other things that you can do with discussions with executives, directors of the business, technical teams, do a bit more of a qualitative analysis as well as a quantitative. And I think the two can go hand in hand very well.
Do you think that's a bit of a change then over the last few years in terms, because like I said at the very beginning, I think it's been quite well known across the space that there is disparate systems, quite often legacy systems, and data quality is quite poor, but it is one of those sectors which there is so much data sort of associated with it, whether that be customer, whether that be sort of asset. What do you think the sort of the shift has been in terms of, it feels now that people are, whether that be execs or sort of generally across the sector, people are now understanding the fact that this is actually critical to sort of move forwards now. What do you think sort of been that shift? Is it regulation? Is it sort of generally sort of pressures from various sort of angles, would you say, or?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few different ways that we could attack this. The regulator has helped make data more important. And I think through the TSMs, through the consumer standards, changes to the SDR, media scrutiny, as well as a changing dynamic in terms of the workforce, particularly at a senior level within our organizations, people are becoming more data-driven, and the importance of data is becoming more and more paramount. And it's amazing to see. It's not become the standard yet across organizations, but a lot of organizations are becoming data-driven through a multitude of these factors. And I think the regulator and assurance has played a massive part in that, but also scrutiny by the media, which is another key point.
Yeah.
Go
on, Andreea, go for it.
Just to add to what Daz has said, I also think I agree the regulator played a very important role, probably is the trigger for this change, which is a good change, very good one. However, what I've noticed is that the majority of our colleagues are also now accepting the fact that we will never have perfect data.
Yeah.
So the journey of starting to move towards insight must run in parallel with other mechanisms of starting to cleanse the data and building better systems that will allow us to do the validation, in the right time and actually build some useful data products at the end of it. And I think that is a very important shift as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. And I think that's something that we kind of experience ourselves at Prodo, because one of our sort of key offerings is self-service portals, self-service apps, and sort of providing that customer interface, which is always integrated with those internal systems that our housing association client. But I think sometimes we do hear that, that there is a little bit of reluctance for maybe some of those integrations to move forwards, because I think the association is kind of waiting for that data, as you put it, to be perfect before sort of moving forward, and that does put a blocker on the potential benefits of things like digital engagement and things. And I think that sort of that phrase you used around, we need to sort of kind of accept that data isn't going to be perfect at any one time. It's just a case of kind of improving things as you can do, and sort of trying to gain the benefit of things like digital self-service and AI, as Daz mentioned earlier. That's a really good point. Eli, from your point of view, you sort of raised an interesting point when we caught up on this, and obviously coming from the outside of the sector into social housing more recently, you mentioned around sort of validating data sources externally. Could you just build upon that a little bit for us?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess in my short stint at the moment within the housing space, when I've talked to other housing associations, when we sort of kick off any research or we're trying to build any models or trying to be proactive by sort of building something that predicts or some sort of prescriptive analysis we're trying to do, in most cases, people are quite insular. They're looking at the data that they've got within that space. Sort of linking this to a point that's kind of been raised, the quality of your model, the quality of the insights you're going to get out of a model are heavily going to be dependent on the data that you're putting into it. And most of the models that we're kind of trying to double with here, especially within the AI space, they're quite data hungry. So the better quality data, or even the more data you plug into those models, the better output you get at the back of it. Not being able to do that, normally you kind of run the risk of a couple of things. So one of those is you can train then a model to produce some insights for you, but because you're quite insular in the way you're treating that data, there's risk of overfitting. In most cases, except maybe as some of the bigger housing associations, you might not necessarily even have enough data points to sort of let's say quality assure your model at the back of it, or even test the predictive power of it. So there's that risk of overfitting. But sometimes as well, so you can do much to produce a model, and it'll give you a statistic and tell you, where you should look at. But what's key in terms of making this land in the business is sort of building that narrative. Actually, the story under the headlines. What's driving those changes you're seeing within the data? This is where sort of using external data is going to be good at building that narrative. So it'll help us have a better understanding of some of the trends we're seeing maybe in an individual housing association point of view is being driven by sort of a wider macroeconomic trends. So using external data will help us to sort of look at that side of things as well. And then taking advantage of open data that's out there to actually cross-validate some of the data we hold internally. So there's some things like, let's say, addresses, for example, some generic data sets. We can actually use data that's publicly available out there to cross-validate and make sure that we've got an accurate record of what we have. The bottom line is you want to create that gold standard data set, and this is going to sort of widely improve the kind of insights you're going to get out of your models at the back of this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is there any... Have you got any thoughts, I suppose, question for any of you really, or maybe all of you? Have you got many, because sometimes one of the questions we get on this session when we're talking about this kind of topic, even around sort of software solutions and things, one of the points we sometimes get raised is there's certain parts of the sector quite interested in driving towards that sort of open data outcome and even sort of shared approaches to software solutions and those sorts of things. Have you got any sort of views on that yourselves in terms of how that could happen, or anything that's sort of holding the sector back from that? Because I know that, whilst the types of data that RPs collect is all going to be quite similar, it's obviously in very, very wildly different formats in systems of wildly different versions, and therefore sort of bringing that together, I'm assuming, is going to be quite difficult to do. Any sort of views on that point from any of you? This might be quite interesting to hear.
I'd say that's quite an interesting point. So this was raised in another forum where there's a group of housing associations that joined. I think it's a Greater Manchester kind of group. So it's kind of having standardized, or at least a document that standardizes our data standards across the board as a starting point that we'll work off. But that also can enable us, once our data is kind of harmonized in the way we capture and recorded, is harmonized or even standardized, we can actually then look at, so within the housing association space, we do a lot in terms of sharing insights and information. I think that culture of collaboration is already there, but there isn't the mechanism to actually share data, for example. So in this case, we can have other housing associations sitting within sort of a similar footprint of where you are. If we create the infrastructure that enables us to share that data in a very secure way, where obviously you're not, you're being compliant with the GDPR and you're not disclosing, sensitive information. So there's something where you can actually now start collaborating from a research point of view. So having those standards, I think, will be something that's quite good across the board.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it will bring incredible benefits, especially for small to medium-sized organizations. That's where we will see the biggest impact. I'm only saying that because larger housing organizations will always look for and will be able to go for more bespoke type of processes with a higher complexity and recording a higher granularity of the data, which will give them in turn better quality insight. But I would argue that is terribly needed on those fronts, just because, the more properties you've got to look after, the more workforce you need and so on and so forth. Whereas for smaller to medium-sized organizations, what the aim is to provide better service, right? Better quality service for our customers and improve the response, that's be more proactive. And that standardization would just help with the validation of the data and become more efficient across the board. So I'm looking forward for more progress on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I just add to this as well? Because I think software providers have a part to play in this. There's a limited number of software suppliers within the sector. There's lots of discussions around, no system is going to be absolutely perfect for every organization. And I think from a data collection point of view, yes, the software has to be able to support what the data that we want to collect and into the standard that we want to maintain it by. But the business also then needs to be able to enter that information into the systems in a way that follows these standards. And this can be things like having mandatory fields in our systems, having input masks, validation, all of these kind of things where technology can do some of the heavy lifting for us. Now, data standards are great because they can standardize what we're doing across the sector. But I think the benefits of it, and I may be more contrarian with this, I think there's other things that we need to address prior to that, and that is around governance. And so the ownership, the accountability and the responsibility for data needs to come first. Data standards are important, but I think the benefits of having standardized data sets across the sector can be overstated. And a lot of this is down is what you're actually doing with that data.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, to be fair. On that governance point, because I know that's another sort of point we're going to address anyway. I think that's quite often seen as a bit of a compliance kind of / admin burden in a way, but I guess as you sort of rightly put it, it is a critical point of this. So how can that be? How can we start to see that as part of the enabler of this, rather than how it's currently seen by some? Would you say?
I think data governance, if implemented poorly, can be quite a bureaucratic process, and it can actually slow down organizations. And the key is finding the balance. So again, if we go right back to the beginning of the conversation around where we are now from a data maturity point of things, if an organization is relatively mature in how they handle data governance could be implemented quite quickly and it can be quite effective. Now, if the culture of that organization and the maturity of that organization is quite low, it becomes more challenging for many different reasons. And I think it has to be something that's slick, that doesn't overwhelm the organization, that doesn't slow down any kind of decision making. That's the key point here. We need to gauge where we are now, to Andrea's point earlier on, to understanding what elements of data governance can we implement and what do we just park for now and slowly drip feed down the organization as we start noticing the culture and behaviors changing around data.
Yeah. Like kind of links us onto the people part, I suppose, quite nicely, that really, because it is that kind of governance piece is something which teams are built around, I suppose, now, and that's kind of an evolving change, really, isn't it, in terms of the importance and focus placed on it. But from your point of view, Daz, as a consultant who's working with many sort of associations across the country, what do you tend to find as barriers to data confidence with housing teams, with the people that you work with?
I think time is one of the biggest things at the moment. I think there's a lot of operational activities that need to happen within the organization. People are really busy. And I think that's probably one of the most challenging and the most resistance that I get from any kind of data activities is that we just don't have the time to do this. People are really maxed out with what they're doing at the moment. And that can be through a combination of tenants' expectations are different now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think there's, like I mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of scrutiny in the media as well. So I think people have lost some confidence there. Challenges with the economy, the cost of living, squeezed operating margins. And I think there's some really good people in this sector that have worked here for a very long time. They're very people focused, they're very customer focused, and they're amazing, absolutely amazing at what they do. But they may not be aware of how technology can help them, how technology can do some of that heavy lifting for them as well. And ultimately that kind of signals that there's quite low levels of data literacy within that organization. And I think this is what we need to tackle to be able to improve the culture and bring people on the journey with us as well. So a lot of it is down to the culture. It's kind of all linked.
And just to kind of not necessarily to add, but to highlight the fact that data governance isn't a buzzword, isn't a nice to have. If you want to treat, and you should treat data as an asset, it needs governance. Yeah. So when you're saying that you want to be data driven and you want to leverage data, you need to have governance in place. So whether you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong, you should be developing that skill of doing it right in parallel to that return on investment you're expecting from investing into a head of data, investing into a central data team, into your tech stack. So if you're actually doing that, you should also make sure you've got the governance in place.
Yeah, crucial to that ROI point you mentioned. Absolutely, isn't it? For sure. Yeah.
Yes.
On the when we were sort of just talking about the people side of things, Eli, you mentioned the phrase psychological safety, which is something we kind of covered on the prep call. So, and I think that came from people quite often maybe don't feel like they're in an environment where they can even ask sort of questions around data and things as a sort of a worry of feeling that they're asking maybe the wrong questions or what have you. So what's your experience of sort of changing that and sort of covering the psychological safety point generally?
Exactly. So psychological safety, one, it links to culture of the organization and the data literacy point that was raised earlier. So culture being a big point here in the sense that if the kind of the way we are used to seeing data and monitoring or the stats that are so served up across the business, it's very much driven on hyper-focusing on a particular statistic. People are going to have hyper attention on that particular statistic moving. But what we naturally need to move away from is actually bringing that contextual information at the back of it. So more looking at monitoring trends rather than following a particular statistic. So one that would then move away from people worrying about, this statistic has moved down, but actually understanding the context behind it. Is the trend going up? Is it going down? Is this something that's happening that's relatively quite seasonal? There's an element as well where you need to ensure that you create space for people to innovate and do some experimentation. So in a very practical sense, let's say for data teams and people that are curious about data, creating some sort of sandbox environment where people can play with the data. Maybe, you take a copy of real life data, so there's not that risk of impacting live systems, and create a group of very curious individuals, whether you create some sort of research questions or deep dives that can be driven by stuff you might be picking up service from customers, for example, maybe what you want to produce is, okay, this statistics have moved up, has moved down, but these are the driving reasons behind it. So do that sort of investigative side of things. But also, if you do it in this sort of sandbox environment, there's not that risk of, okay, if this doesn't go well, there's replications in the back of this. There's also a bit about having that messaging coming from the top of the office, from senior leaders as well, so that people feel free to sort of experiment and make sure that if things go wrong, that's fine. That's part of experimenting. So there's some things I think that would be quite good for this.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect point. It's something which we had Nick Atkin on, CEO of Yorkshire Housing, on a previous Hive, talking about something very similar. It was more sort of around the AI side of things, but data definitely formed part of that. And his view as sort of leader of the organisation was very much around, I as the leader need to sort of create that space for people to have access to this, because otherwise they'll try and do it their own way, and that's where the sort of the risk for these sorts of things come into play, because the potential impact there is therefore not as controllable as it would be if we put that sort of controlled environment in place. So I think that's a great point. Have you seen, Daz, any sort of good examples of that across your work, across the space, around sort of people being brought on board with this kind of thing in terms of building confidence and capability in that way from a people point of view?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably a prerequisite step really in terms of how you actually provide space for people to be able to have that kind of capability and build their data confidence. And a lot of that is around prioritizing what the business is doing. So we always see a huge list of projects, programs, and a massive portfolio that the business wants to do. And it's now impossible to actually get that capacity when the business is undergoing so much change, and there's so many different projects that are in circulation at the moment, but limited resource to deal with them. And I think we have seen some really good examples of the data governance boards coming together, prioritizing what the business is trying to do from a data, a digital and technology perspective, and just trying to be a bit more realistic. So I think if we have senior leaders within the organization that can be a bit more realistic about what's possible under the constraints of that organization, it'll really unlock that capability to start looking at how digital technology can then benefit the organization to actually save time, make colleagues more efficient, and then create that space. This could be anything from RPA, and going forward, and we'll start to see this more and more, AI agents will actually start to create capacity within the sector as well. Yeah. Once that capacity has then been realized, there's a lot that we can do to help colleagues become a bit more confident with data, improve data literacy across the entire organization. So there's so many things that we can do in this space.
Mm-hmm.
On your point from the sort of earlier on, Andreea, around sort of the importance of assessing the now in terms of how things are status quo wise, presumably as part of that, you'd be looking around things to do with sort of understanding current team capability and those sorts of things. Have you got much experience of sort of assessing current team capability with regards to data and sort of governance and things, and then therefore having to tailor the approach off the back of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think establishing the foundational and the starting point must absolutely include capability assessment. And in my view, that can be done internally quite quickly, because it becomes apparent from conversations with individuals, from the understanding as to whether is there a central data team, and how much reliance does the business have on the central data team, and what are the outputs of this team. Because if the outputs are solely around business monitoring, so KPIs, and very limited in terms of the creation of insights or any triangulation of data, that is a very clear indicator in terms of capabilities. And that then needs to be embedded into your strategy as to what is our vision and what type of skills do we need to develop. So we move from business monitoring into insight and prediction of what's going to happen next.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think that's a great point, actually, because I do see lots of organizations that can be very performance driven. And this is, they're just looking at KPIs. They're not looking at why things are happening or understanding the root cause of why things are happening as well. And I think the larger the organization, they have made huge strides in that space as well. But the small and mid-sized organizations often grapple with moving away from being having a KPI culture and people not really understanding outside of these KPIs what data is actually being used for. So, for example, in some organizations that aren't very data mature, we're looking at things like colleagues that provide statistics on a monthly basis, KPIs, to go if somebody collects them, but they don't know why they're being collected or what it's actually used for or what purpose it's being used for, who it goes to. And that's a challenge. And I think there's some work that we need to do in this sector to become a bit more transparent about what their data is being used for and how it's actually going to affect what the business does, and ultimately the impact that it's going to have on the people that we serve, the tenants.
And to this point, Daz, I think it's very important, once you've moved into a space of having a data strategy, you also need to have a comms strategy around data, because that's what will give us the platform to helping our colleagues become more in tune with data conversations. and creating that safe space for people to start asking questions.
Yeah, and I think once you start, if you start at the beginning of the journey where organizations are very KPI driven and it's very manual, you're right, a data strategy is needed. So you've got your vision for what you're trying to get to. And I think you then start having the conversations with the data team, with the technical colleagues to understand what skills have we got against what we need in the future. So year 1, year 2, year 3, if we are looking at building some kind of technical infrastructure, what training do we need? What kind of specialist skills do we need to bring in? And then start to develop bespoke training plans, because more often than not, you have got some really good skills within the business, but they might not be where you think they are. And I think that's the key thing, is to unlock what you've got, not necessarily looking just within the technical domain, but people who are curious with data that have got lots of potential. And I think that's where you really start to map out what skills you've got now against what you need in the future.
Yeah. The only point I was to bring on that one is just something I've had experience with as well, is a case of, as data people, we are normally quite good at speaking data language, but obviously this needs to land within the business. So sometimes actually ensuring when you're doing that user requirements gathering, whether you want to produce some sort of insight or some sort of report here, have somebody within the business be able to make sense of it. If they can actually derive insight from it, or even the way you service that data, this could be down to even the visualizations you're using. Does that make it easier for somebody to actually get the right narrative in terms of what you're trying to put across as well? There's also an element of sometimes which is not made quite clear and transparent, is you can produce some sort of insight, but being able to clarify the limitations of how far you can interpret and read into this data, because it does happen often where somebody sees some graph somewhere or some statistics somewhere, but the story they get out of it is completely different to the initial purpose why it was served. So it's good to understand how the business speaks and speak in their language rather than data language.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, that in terms of the adjusting the presentation of the output, whatever the output might be, based on audience types, I suppose, because we'll often see that ourselves when it's more sort of like a digital lens around talking about potential software solutions or the benefit of them, and then you naturally get the question in a room of many different stakeholders of, well, what about this? What about that? The sort of the conversation, just sort of an expectation all of a sudden grows, and then the expectation of the results kind of grows with it, when really the sort of the scope of it and potential benefit, it should be quite focused really. So I think that's a great point. Just before we do move on to the culture point, I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier on, Eli, and I know you're quite fresh into the space yourself, having worked outside elsewhere before. But we touched upon potentially taking inspiration from other more innovative sectors in terms of sort of help shift perceptions around data and sort of technology and those sorts of things around that. Have you got any examples of those? I think there's some really obvious ones that we sort of often refer to when we're talking about sort of digital, and particularly from our perspective, from a self-service point of view, people will often sort of quickly start thinking about banking experiences, using online banking for apps, and even sort of e-commerce sites for certain things and those sorts of things. But is there anything in particular that sort of spring to mind from an innovative sort of examples point of view, from a data perspective, that you've come across?
Exactly. So some of the interesting bits where you get some interesting insight when you look sort of outside housing industry, for example, if you have an opportunity to sit in platforms where you can attend conferences where they're cross the industry, that'd be very useful. So a good example is maybe take people within the marketing space. So especially if they're kind of being data driven and sort of at the front end of leading data within the marketing space, they have to do a lot in terms of like actually figuring out how they make this interesting insight, how it lands into how sort of people are going to consume that data. They also have to do a lot in terms of like how they're going to nudge behavior. So there's a lot we can learn from that space, but they also then bring in this side of using data and behavioral insights as well. So we can sort of learn from what they've done there and sort of apply it within our space. One, to nudge culture within sort of our own housing associations, but also identifying, let's say, some other models you can use, whether in instances where you're, let's say, dealing with quantitative, sort of qualitative data, and you want to get insight out of it. People within that marketing industry, they do that. That's their sort of day-to-day bread and butter stuff. So you can sort of pinch some of the models that they're using there and apply within our space, rather than reinventing the wheel.
I think a lot of this is around understanding what's possible. Because I think within our sector as well, we can be quite insular. And a lot of people that have worked within our sector have worked within our sector for quite some time. But the grass isn't always greener when you look to the private sector or the elements of the public sector. And then within our sector, it's not fast-moving consumer goods. We're not looking at heavy, like millions and millions of rows of transactional data coming in all the time. And I've worked in different organizations in different sectors, and they still have similar problems. So, for example, education data, they have student data, but there's big problems in that. There's gaps all over the place. Like in our sector, there's gaps in our stock condition data. It's the same problems, but just a different context. And I think for us, what we can learn from others outside of the sector is just how to work smarter, because we don't work in an overly complex sector, but we're very inefficient in what we do. So we need to look at how digital technology can help us, how AI agents can help us, how RPA can be used more and more to stop some of these repetitive tasks taking place. That's what we need to do as a sector, I think, and that's where we can take innovation from what others are doing.
That's a great point, and I think I like how you kind of linked that back, Eli, to the marketing space in terms of what's the art of the possible, and sort of how that kind of I suppose industry, if you like, handles this sort of stuff. We brought onto the Hive a couple of times last year, actually. The managing director of our sister company, Felius, who are a marketing automation and sort of growth agency, if you like, in terms of using CRM for those sorts of things, working with very much kind of B2B customers in the insurance, leisure and tourism space and sort of elsewhere. And Paul was kind of touching on the Hive to the housing sort of professionals with us that day around, some of the things they do is very much sort of contact list segmentation based upon certain triggers and certain criteria, whether that be sort of interactions or engaging in certain ways with some sort of asset online or a chatbot or over the phone, and then therefore using that criteria to take people down a certain path. And wouldn't that be great in the housing space to be able to do that? It's certainly possible. It's just you need to have the technology in place which enables that sort of functionality, and also the data sort of feeding into that, I suppose. So that's a great point. On the sort of the culture side of things, then, because we've kind of covered the foundations and I think people quite well there, and it's already 1:45, and we said we were going to talk about this all day, and I think we definitely could. on the culture side of things, in terms of making data stick, another one of the points, Eli, you mentioned when we sort of caught up was, and I think we've kind of alluded to this a little bit already, but in terms of organisations sort of planning for this, and obviously having been through the foundation element and sort of kind of assessing capabilities and things, the point of making quite a lot of change in one go versus almost kind of nudged based tactics, which is something we talk a hell of a lot about ourselves as well. And you mentioned leaning towards that kind of nudge side of things in terms of helping make this sort of change stick. You can sort of build upon there a little bit for us.
So this goes to what the challenge has brought up most of the time. So culture is very much interlinked with the data governance side of things, and to engage with this, most people say there's not time or resources to do this. So sometimes it's always a challenge to do the ideal, which would be the big bang approach. If you could do it, there just won't be the resource within the business to do it. And sometimes you're making assumptions about data literacy across the business in order to do that. The times when it's been kind of successful, where you basically use an agile approach, a piece by piece approach. What that helps you do as well, it helps you refine how you comms the importance of this across the business as you're sort of deploying it, but also it helps you actually quickly show return on investment. So let's say you do a bite size where you take a particular area within the business and you sort of sort out their governance and try and sort out their data. You can then actually show the real results to the business in terms of actually this is what it can help in order to, if you engage with let's say data governance and ways to improve our data. The other side of it as well, when it comes to approaching in a bite size way, is that the challenge you'll normally get across the business is a lot of the stuff we're doing here to improve data, they're very much long-term. They're going to require a lot of effort. So there is that bit of trying to manage those expectations up front. Just say, it's not a case of like, we're going to do this one time and then that's it, it's done. It's going to be an ongoing process. So changing expectations from that point of view, that it's not a one-stop activity and then that's it. But it's an ongoing process to continuously improve your data.
And to that point, I think it's very important it's actually crucial to focus on use cases that are relevant and in line with the strategy of the organization, because that's going to give you the buy-in from senior leadership, and also you can manage expectations better. When it comes to data, I think a lot of our colleagues either put it into a too difficult box or I don't understand it because I'm not a data person. It's not my problem. And I think it's that type of mindset that needs to be changed, because if we were to take an analogy, like no one's interested in the ingredients of preparing a pizza, but everyone likes a pizza. So no one's interested in the raw data and the pipeline for data and how do we ingest that? How is that accessible? Data visualization tools and so on and so forth. I appreciate that, but everyone should be focused and should try to understand, what do our customers need? Where are the problems in our homes? Okay, so I think as data leaders, we need to focus a lot on this cultural aspect to shift the mindset that there is some sort of difference in between the two. Now, we've got the same goal and the same role within this sector, because this sector is different to other sectors in the sense that we are here to look after sometimes some of the most vulnerable people in the country. So we have a duty to try to understand and leverage everything we've got to be better, to provide better service.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly when the way the sort of regulations continue evolving around sort of very much RPs being measured on those sorts of elements around how well do you know your customers, how well do you understand what's in your properties and what you need to do next with it, what are your customers' preferences and sort of how are you acting upon that. It kind of all, you're right, it all forms part of that strategy, and it's rather than a sort of part A and part B, they are very much interlinked, aren't they, and kind of rely upon one another to get to that end goal, really, I suppose. With the sort of whole conversation around sort of planning for this and sort of nudge-based tactics to bring people on the journey and things, how would you say, I suppose investment into this area is recognised from an ROI point of view? Because I know that sometimes when investment is attached to this sort of thing, then ROI is expected. Maybe it's certain organisations sooner than others. So how do you handle that from what we're going to get from this from an ROI point of view?
Yeah,
I suppose questions to all of you, really. Go on, Daz.
Yeah, I could tackle that one, I think. In terms of ROI, it's difficult. It is really difficult to demonstrate some of the return on investment that you're going to get from some of your data activities, particularly if you've got like a longer term data strategy as well. But I think if we can get the foundation right first, because I'm a big fan of getting the foundation right, and for me that's all around governance. And again, we know it's not a sexy term, but it is exactly what needs to happen. We need to get that data governance right. But I think, and again, to take Andrea's point, it's a use case approach. That's the only way that we can demonstrate the value of what we're trying to do. So, for example, while we're in the lab, behind the scenes, locked in a cupboard, trying to do the more foundational things like building a data lake, building a data warehouse, doing all of these things, how are we going to pop our heads up and show value to the business? Because the business are not going to tolerate 12, 24, 36 months of, here's a shiny new data lake when we've missed 3 years of potential showing value. So what can we do about that? It's using more fundamental initiatives that are taking place right now. Some of the biggest issues that landlords are facing right now, this could be disrepair and legal claims, it could be damp and mold, it could be silent tenants, or even bread and butter activity like compliance, now the TSMs and the consumer standards, doing some kind of analytics around that while some of the larger initiatives are happening in the background proves your worth as a data leader and as a data team. If you can demonstrate through the leadership of the organization that the benefits that data can have, you will have more flexibility to actually continue doing the larger initiatives in the background. I think that's the key bit.
Yeah, great. No, it's good. It's a good point. Have you ever seen it as I suppose as kind of simple as, the measurements around regulation these days kind of changing, and obviously GV and C coming into play now. Could you even see it as quite simple as we need to do this in order to sort of reach our regulation that we're measured on? From an ROI point of view, you might want to be looking at sort of monetary values and figures in terms of savings, capacity, and sort of efficiencies, etc. But part of it has to be customer satisfaction improvement, and obviously part of it kind of forms part of those GV and C ratings, I suppose. Well, is it an experience of sort of people measuring it that way? I suppose is it literally as high a level as that? I guess
it can be. I think a lot of the time it's efficiency. It's, how long are things taking? How many people are involved in doing this activity kind of thing? And, the calculations can be quite simple based on that. Other times can be quite complex if you haven't got documented processes or there's multiple people in multiple departments, trying to pull together to do similar things. It's not quite as straightforward as that. But then it goes, how mature are you as an organization with your data? The more mature you are, the easier it is to quantify.
Yeah. And I guess back to that point you made, Andreea, around the fact that the understanding the now is actually critical and important, because in terms of looking at what the potential benefits have been, you wouldn't know, would you, unless you sort of had a very sort of informed picture and understanding of what it looked like pre-investment and sort of post and sort of ongoing, I suppose, as well. In terms of, I suppose, part of the end goal of this then, generally, in terms of looking forwards around an embedded data culture in an organisation, what would that kind of look like for an organisation, and how would you know that you're on the way to becoming that? I suppose a question for any of you or all of you again.
So is this a case of, how do you know you're becoming more data focused as an organisation? Yeah. I think, but for me, it's going to be when decisions start with data. I think that's the key thing here. When we know that when any decision is being made within the business, it could be a course correction, it could be a new corporate plan, it's using data to actually develop that, which is the key thing for me here. When the executive constantly asks, what's the data telling us? Because leadership should be modeling data-driven behavior. Without that, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually change the culture of an organization as well. And other smaller things like, data entry becomes more important for customer-facing colleagues. Absolutely key. Data quality improves if you're tracking your learning and development, training statistics go up in the technical space, data protection, other kind of data visualization courses that are on offer as well. And I think I mentioned this earlier as well around transparency as well. So people within the organization, the senior leaders within the organization are sharing corporate and departmental dashboards, OKRs are being saved, performance metrics are being shared with the organization as well. And people understand how their operational activities, how they feed some of the larger deliverables and initiatives within that organization. I think that's a great way of understanding where you are and how data culture is improving over time.
Yeah, just to add to that one, I think a good indicator is also the behavior of our colleagues and also supply and demand. So it's based on what they're asking the central data team to do or provide for them. Yeah, so if they are still on the path of just asking for data extracts, for example, or particular reports, as opposed to trying to answer a question or fixing a problem within the business, then you know where the organization is in terms of that understanding of data and using it.
For me, sometimes a good pinch point is so in any organization, you have a finance team that normally has to do some annual reporting, and they're normally pulling in stats from all over the place, SDR to mention one of those. But sometimes it's like how many corrections you have to go into that, how many queries of teams, how much of a resource burden that becomes. So if your data is in a good space, that resource burden should be far less when it comes to that sort of end of year reporting period as well. We should have a more sort of our fingers on the pulse in terms of actually not waiting for a year end, but get a good picture of where we are across different areas of the business, almost like at least on a monthly basis, or at least on a regular basis, rather than always trying to get that picture at the end of the year. So when we get to that space where we can sort of understand our resources,
makes total sense. Great stuff. Thanks, guys. We have had a couple of questions through from Dave Rigby, actually, two very different questions. So I'll start with the first one, which was around how would the panel work with directorates that deliver the social value work to develop data-driven reporting? Anyone got any sort of any thoughts on that for Dave?
And how would we work at that? So I think the main thing, as we said at the start, is to establish the right forums for these conversations to take place. So as a data leader, you need to have to spend time with senior leadership, quite a lot of time, to understand what they are struggling with and where do they need help. From there, you can then tailor use cases that are actually in line with the strategic objectives. And that should be the main focus for every single data leader. Otherwise, you are not relevant to senior leadership, and therefore data isn't relevant or at the center of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think with social value, it's quite a wide topic, isn't it? I think there's a lot of different initiatives that organizations, particularly the larger ones, are doing around social value space. Now, I think in terms of creating data-driven reporting based on the back of these activities, we need to understand what each activity is trying to achieve. Metrics can be produced. It might not be quantitative, it may be qualitative, it could be feedback, it could be sentiment analysis. Again, it's very much dependent on the type of activity that's happening and what outcome you're trying to achieve. Then we can then have a look at a suitable form of reporting that supports that and demonstrates value. Hopefully that answers your questions, Dave.
The only thing I was going to say, there is the initial bit where actually sometimes you need to define a reliable way of capturing social value activities. So whether you're classifying certain types of activities as sort of feeding into social value, and you have a reliable way of actually feeding through that data so you can report on it.
Great stuff. That makes total sense. Thanks for that, guys. Hopefully that answers your initial question, Dave. The other one was separate, but interested if you guys have got some thoughts on this as well. So are there any apprenticeships / personal development pathways that you'd recommend to develop staff into technical data positions, professionals?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, it depends on the discipline, because there is a misconception that somebody that's quite good on Excel can do everything data, particularly within some of the smaller organizations that I work with. I think we need to understand what kind of discipline that we're targeting here. It could be engineering and architecture, it could be governance, it could be data visualization, analytics, it could be leadership. But there is a lot of providers out there that provide apprenticeships from level 3 all the way to level 7, which is a master's degree in like leadership, data science, Python, all that kind of stuff. So there's no one size fits all. I think once you've got a data strategy, you understand what the vision is that you're trying to achieve, looking at what skills you've got, to Andrea's point earlier on, mapping out what you need, and then developing bespoke training plans depending on where your gaps are. So it's very dependent on the discipline that you're going for. There's lots of things out there.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Hopefully that helps for you, Dave. Thanks for that, Daz. Brilliant. Well, it's nearly 12 o'clock, guys, and ever since Andreea mentioned pizza, I've been quite hungry.
Pizza for lunch.
A few just final takeaways, I suppose, in terms of what we've covered today. So, good decisions start with those strong foundational pieces that we kind of covered. So, understanding where things are right now before going after the shiny stuff later, and I think that kind of forms part of everything we've kind of said today in terms of how the current governance is set up, what the data strategy currently looks like, and what the current team's sort of capability is. People bringing those on board is critical. People need to feel confident, safe, and included in the journey. Otherwise, people just you won't gain buy-in, whether that be from leadership or sort of people day to day. And the real change can potentially take time. It's not just the sort of the day-to-day tasks. It's kind of more culture-led and not just dashboards. It's everything that kind of goes along with it. But some of the things that you'll see if you're on the right path is that people will be making data-driven decisions, and data will form part of conversations around decision-making as well. But the impact is potentially huge. And yeah, one point that you made yourself, Andreea, when we caught up on this a couple of weeks ago, one of the points you made is that, you will get to a stage where you'll start to build confidence in your data and you will start to see value from it. Action obviously needs to be taken. We've covered some of those actions that you probably should be looking at depending upon the stage that you're at yourselves today. But you will start gaining benefit from it. It can be done, but it is just one of those which can take time and needs to be sort of positioned in the right way, I suppose. So yeah, thank you guys for your time and sort of insight today. Just two quick final points before we do finish up for the session. If we've covered anything today that anyone would like to sort of pick up a one-to-one discussion on directly, we will be offering Housing Hive attendees a free, no obligation sort of consultation call. Our contacts tend to value that and sort of see benefit just to use that to validate some thoughts, some assumptions, and maybe ask some follow-up questions, explore how certain ideas could be practically applied as well, and just use us as a critical friend for advice. Daz is open to sort of joining us on some of those calls as well. So if anyone is interested in those, please feel free. And yeah, final point, we do have our next Housing Hive session scheduled for the 29th of May. So as usual, last Thursday of the month. And the topic's going to be around a year on from consumer standards being put in place. I suppose a bit of a reflection on that in terms of how we've seen change and some sort of thoughts and insights from sector experts on that particular topic as well. So look out for that, and there'll be some guest speakers announced quite soon as well. But yeah, finally, just wanted to thank you all for your time today, for joining and sort of listening to the session, and you three guys, Daz, Andreea, and Eli, for providing your time, insights, and very honest opinions on this topic as well. It's obviously a really critical one, and which people today hopefully have taken things from, but something we'll probably continue the conversation on at a later date, hopefully as well. So thank you all again very much, and hopefully we'll see you guys for the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Take care.